A prospector named George Carmack pulls a gold nugget the size of his thumb from a creek in Canada's Yukon territory in August 1896. Within weeks, the news reaches the outside world. Within months, 100,000 people from across North America and beyond will abandon their lives, quit their jobs, leave their families, and head north to the Klondike seeking instant wealth. Most will never reach the goldfields. Of those who do, the vast majority will find nothing, and the few who strike it rich will discover that gold brings as many problems as it solves. The Klondike Gold Rush lasted barely 3 years, from 1896 to 1899, but it became the most famous gold rush in history. It created boom towns that appeared overnight and vanished just as quickly. It killed thousands through starvation, exposure, avalanches, and disease. It made a handful of prospectors fabulously wealthy while bankrupting tens of thousands of dreamers. And it turned the route to the Klondike into one of the deadliest trails in North America, where the weak died and the strong often wish they had. This is the story of the Klondike Gold Rush, where 100,000 people gambled everything on a dream, where 30,000 actually reached the goldfields, and where only 4,000 found enough gold to matter. This is about greed, desperation, endurance, and the price of chasing wealth through frozen hell. George Washington Carmack wasn't looking for gold when he found it. A California-born drifter who had made his way north to Alaska and the Yukon, Carmack had married a Tagish woman named Kate and was living a subsistence life fishing salmon. He was more interested in cutting timber than prospecting, but on August 16, 1896, while camping along Rabbit Creek with his indigenous brothers-in-law Skookum Jim and Tagish Charlie, they discovered gold. The exact story of who found the gold first is disputed. Carmack later claimed he discovered it. Skookum Jim's family insists he was the one who spotted gold in the creek. Tagish Charlie may have been involved. The truth is lost to history and competing claims. What's certain is that the three men staked claims on what would become the richest gold-bearing creek in the Klondike, and Carmack registered the discovery because indigenous people weren't allowed to stake claims under Canadian law. Carmack renamed Rabbit Creek to Bonanza Creek, an accurate prediction of what was coming. Word spread through the small prospecting community already in the Yukon. Within days, every inch of Bonanza Creek had been claimed. Prospectors who arrived late staked claims on nearby creeks with names like El Dorado and Hunker that reflected their hopes. Some of these secondary creeks proved almost as rich as Bonanza itself. The initial rush was local, confined to prospectors already in Alaska and the Yukon. These men, already experienced in northern conditions and mining techniques, staked the best claims before the outside world even knew gold had been found. By the time the news reached civilization, all the easily accessible, obviously rich ground had been claimed. The prospectors who would pour north in 1897 and 1898 would be chasing claims that had already been staked, buying rights from original claimants or hoping to discover new deposits. The news traveled slowly in 1896. The Yukon was isolated, accessible only by arduous overland routes or river travel that froze solid in winter. The prospectors who struck it rich in late 1896 had to wait until summer 1897 to leave with their gold. When they finally arrived in Seattle and San Francisco in July 1897, carrying sacks and trunks filled with gold dust and nuggets, the news exploded. 2 ships docked almost simultaneously, one in Seattle and one in San Francisco, carrying approximately 2 tons of gold between them. Newspapers ran headlines screaming about instant fortunes made in the frozen north. Reporters interviewed prospectors who had arrived penniless and were now carrying $50,000 or more in gold, equivalent to over $1 million today. The stories triggered madness. The timing was perfect for a gold rush. The United States was emerging from the panic of 1893, a severe economic depression that had left millions unemployed and desperate. Working men saw no future in their current circumstances. The Klondike represented escape, opportunity, the chance to transform their lives through one lucky strike. The fact that most wouldn't succeed didn't matter. The dream was enough. People quit stable jobs, sold their possessions, borrowed money, and headed north with no experience in mining, no knowledge of northern conditions, and no realistic understanding of what they were attempting. The gold rush became a mass movement driven by desperation, greed, and wildly unrealistic expectations. Newspapers fueled the frenzy with exaggerated stories of easy wealth and glossed over the dangers and difficulties. Getting to the Klondike required reaching Dawson City, the boomtown that sprang up at the confluence of the Klondike and Yukon rivers. But Dawson was in the middle of nowhere, hundreds of miles from the nearest port, accessible only through brutal overland routes or river navigation. The journey itself would kill hundreds and break thousands more. Most stampeders, as the gold seekers were called, chose one of two main routes. The all-water route involved sailing to St. Michael on Alaska's western coast, then traveling 1,700 miles up the Yukon River by steamboat. This route was expensive, slow, and could only be attempted in summer when the river wasn't frozen. The overland routes were faster but far more dangerous, requiring stampeders to cross mountain passes with all their supplies on their backs. The two most popular overland routes were the Chilkoot Trail and the White Pass Trail, both starting from the Alaska Panhandle ports of Dyea and Skagway, respectively. Both routes required climbing steep mountain passes to reach the headwaters of the Yukon River system, where stampeders could build boats and float downstream to Dawson. Both routes were nightmares of mud, ice, exhaustion, and death. Canadian authorities, worried about stampeders arriving in the Yukon without supplies and starving to death, imposed a requirement. Every person entering Canadian territory had to bring 1 ton of supplies, roughly a year's worth of food and equipment. This made sense for survival, but created a logistical nightmare. Each stampeder had to transport 2,000 pounds of supplies over mountain passes where the trail was often too narrow for pack animals and too steep for wagons. The solution was backpacking in stages. Stampeders would carry a load of supplies up the trail, cache it, return for another load, carry it forward, and repeat the process 30 or 40 times until all their supplies reached the summit. A single trip to the Klondike might require walking the same trail sections 50 times or more, carrying 60-pound packs on each trip. The physical toll was staggering. The Chilkoot Pass became the most iconic image of the gold rush. The final approach to the summit was a 35-degree ice staircase carved into the mountainside, nicknamed the Golden Stairs. Stampeders climbed single file, each step carved by the boots of previous climbers, carrying their packs and trying not to look down. If you stepped out of line, you lost your place and had to start over from the bottom. The line moved continuously, day and night, thousands of people climbing an icy staircase to reach the summit. Avalanches were the greatest danger. Snow accumulated on steep slopes above the pass, and when it broke loose, it swept everything in its path down the mountain. The deadliest avalanche occurred on April 3, 1898, when approximately 60 stampeders were buried and killed. Bodies weren't recovered until the snow melted weeks later. The survivors simply stepped over the slide debris and continued climbing, driven by gold fever too strong to be deterred by death. The White Pass Trail, while not as steep as the Chilkoot, earned the nickname Dead Horse Trail. Pack animals could be used on parts of White Pass, but the trail was so difficult that horses and mules died by the thousands. Stampeders drove animals beyond their capacity, beat them when they faltered, and abandoned them when they could no longer move. The trail became littered with dead and dying horses. Some estimates suggest 3,000 horses died on White Pass during the gold rush, creating a stench of death that hung over the route. Once stampeders reached the summit, they faced another challenge: transporting their supplies down to the lakes at the headwaters of the Yukon River system. The Canadian side of the passes was less steep, but still required weeks of backpacking. Then came the lakes and rapids. Stampeders built crude boats from whipsawed lumber, loaded their supplies, and attempted to navigate rivers they'd never seen before. Miles Canyon and Whitehorse Rapids were the worst obstacles. The river narrowed into steep-walled canyons where the current accelerated to terrifying speeds. Boats capsized, supplies were lost, people drowned. The Canadian Mounted Police eventually required that women and children portage around the rapids rather than risk the passage. Hundreds of boats were destroyed, forcing stampeders to build new ones or abandon the journey. Those who survived the journey arrived in Dawson City to discover a reality far from their dreams. Every worthwhile claim had been staked long before they arrived. The original prospectors, along with the first wave of stampeders who had arrived in 1897, had claimed every inch of gold-bearing ground. Late arrivals found nothing available to stake unless they bought claims from existing owners at inflated prices. Dawson City itself was a surreal place, a frontier town of 30,000 people that had been wilderness 2 years earlier. Built on swampy ground where the Klondike River met the Yukon, Dawson had no infrastructure, no sewage system, no organized government initially. Streets were mud in summer and ice in winter. Buildings were thrown together from rough lumber or logs, often without proper foundations, sometimes sinking into the permafrost. The cost of everything in Dawson was astronomical. Supplies had to be transported hundreds of miles, and merchants charged accordingly. A single egg could cost $1, equivalent to $30 today. Flour, bacon, beans, everything was priced at levels that quickly depleted stampeders' funds. Men who had arrived with what they thought was adequate money found themselves broke within weeks, unable to afford basic necessities. Work was available for those willing to give up their prospecting dreams. Successful claim owners needed laborers to work their claims. The going rate was $15 a day plus food, extraordinary wages for the era. Many stampeders ended up working for wages on other men's claims, earning steady money while watching the claim owners get rich from gold that workers helped extract. The saloons and dance halls of Dawson became legendary. Gambling houses operated continuously, offering faro, poker, and other games where prospectors lost their gold dust as fast as they could mine it. Dance hall girls entertained miners, charging $1 per dance and earning percentages of the drinks they convinced customers to buy. Some made far more money than miners ever did, extracting gold from prospectors' pokes through entertainment rather than manual labor. Big Alex McDonald became the prototype of Klondike's success. Arriving with almost nothing, he never personally mined gold. Instead, he bought fractional interests in claims, sold supplies to prospectors, and reinvested his profits in more claims. By 1898, McDonald owned interests in dozens of producing claims and was called the King of the Klondike. His success came from business acumen, not from swinging a pickaxe. Belinda Mulrooney represented another path to wealth. She arrived in Dawson in 1897 with a shipment of hot water bottles and cotton, luxury goods that prospectors would pay premium prices for. She sold her inventory for enormous profit, then built the Fairview Hotel, the finest accommodation in Dawson. While prospectors were freezing in tents, Mulrooney was running a profitable business serving their needs. She became one of the wealthiest people in the Klondike without ever mining an ounce of gold. The reality became clear to most stampeders within weeks of arrival. They weren't going to get rich. The good claims were taken. Starting a new claim from scratch required capital they didn't have. Working for wages meant earning good money, but not life-changing wealth. Many stampeders faced a choice: stay in Dawson working for wages, or return home having spent their savings on a futile journey. Those who did own claims faced the brutal reality of Klondike gold mining. The gold wasn't lying on the surface waiting to be picked up. It was buried in gravel deposits 10 to 20 feet below the surface, and the ground was permanently frozen solid. Mining required thawing the frozen ground, digging through it, and separating gold from tons of worthless gravel. The thawing process was primitive and dangerous. Miners built fires on the ground surface to thaw the top layer of permafrost. Once a few inches thawed, they dug it out and built another fire to thaw the next layer. This process continued until they reached bedrock, where the richest gold deposits lay. A single shaft to bedrock could take weeks of continuous labor, burning enormous quantities of firewood and requiring round-the-clock work. Winter was actually the best mining season, counterintuitively. In summer, the surface layer thawed into mud and water, making it nearly impossible to work. In winter, the frozen ground was solid enough to tunnel into once fire had thawed it. Miners worked through winter's darkness, temperatures dropping to -40 or colder, living in crude cabins and subsisting on monotonous diets of bacon, beans, and sourdough bread. Scurvy was the biggest health threat. The diet of preserved foods lacked vitamin C, causing this deficiency disease that had plagued Arctic explorers for centuries. Symptoms progressed from fatigue and joint pain to bleeding gums, tooth loss, and eventually death if untreated. Fresh fruits and vegetables, which would have prevented scurvy, were unavailable in Dawson for most of the year and prohibitively expensive when they were. Miners died of scurvy throughout the gold rush, their bodies not discovered until spring thaw. The work was backbreaking even for those on rich claims. Gravel had to be hauled to the surface in buckets, then stockpiled until spring, when running water would be available for washing. Sluice boxes, long wooden troughs with riffles on the bottom, were used to separate gold from gravel. Water and gravel were shoveled through the sluice, and the gold, being heavier, would settle behind the riffles while lighter material washed away. Cleanup day, when miners dismantled their sluices to collect accumulated gold, determined whether months of labor had been worthwhile. Rich claims might yield several $1,000s in gold from a single cleanup. Poor claims might produce only a few $100s or nothing at all. Miners wouldn't know whether their claim was valuable until after months of work. The uncertainty was psychologically torturous. Partnerships were common, but often ended badly. Mining was too difficult for one person to do alone, so prospectors formed partnerships to share labor and costs. But dividing gold discovered jointly led to disputes, accusations of cheating, and frequent violence. Men who had been friends became enemies over disagreements about gold distribution. Some partnerships ended in murder. Many claims that seemed promising initially turned out to be worthless. Gold in the Klondike was distributed unevenly. One claim might have rich gold deposits, while an adjacent claim had nothing. Prospectors bought claims based on rumors and speculation, often paying inflated prices for ground that produced minimal gold. Fortunes were lost buying worthless claims just as fortunes were made selling them. News of gold discoveries in Nome, Alaska, reached Dawson in 1899. Suddenly, stampeders who had struggled for years in the Klondike had a new destination offering potentially easier wealth. Thousands abandoned Dawson, boarding steamers down the Yukon River and across to Nome. The population of Dawson began hemorrhaging as quickly as it had grown. The easy gold was gone by 1899 anyway. The richest surface deposits on Bonanza and Eldorado Creeks had been mined out. What remained required industrial mining techniques, hydraulic mining, dredges, and capital investment beyond what individual prospectors could afford. Large companies began buying up claims, consolidating operations, and employing wage workers. The era of the individual prospector striking it rich was over. Those who had found gold faced new problems. Many prospectors who made fortunes in Dawson lost them just as quickly through bad investments, gambling, or simply spending recklessly. Stories of prospectors buying rounds of drinks for entire saloons, paying thousands of dollars for eggs and champagne, or gambling away years of mining profits in single nights were common. Wealth acquired suddenly was lost just as suddenly. Getting gold out of the Klondike was its own challenge. Banks didn't exist initially. Prospectors carried their gold as dust or nuggets, weighing it on small scales to conduct transactions. Gold dust was the circulating currency in Dawson, with bartenders, merchants, and prostitutes all accepting it as payment. Theft was common. Prospectors who struck it rich had to physically transport their gold to civilization, a dangerous journey where robbery was a constant threat. Some successful prospectors reinvested their gold in Dawson businesses, becoming merchants or saloon owners. Others left the Yukon as quickly as possible, taking their wealth and returning to civilization. A few remained, becoming permanent Yukon residents and transitioning from prospecting to other livelihoods. Most, having found nothing, simply left broke and exhausted, returning to the lives they had abandoned 3 years earlier with nothing to show for their efforts. The statistics of the Klondike Gold Rush reveal its true nature. Of the estimated 100,000 people who set out for the Klondike, only about 30,000 actually reached Dawson City. The rest turned back along the trails, unable to endure the journey, running out of money, or dying en route. Of the 30,000 who reached Dawson, only about 4,000 found meaningful amounts of gold. The rest found nothing or just enough to cover their expenses. Death toll estimates vary, but several thousand people died during the gold rush. Avalanches, drowning, exposure, starvation, scurvy, typhoid, and violence all took their toll. The exact number will never be known because many who died in remote locations were never found or recorded. The routes to the Klondike were littered with graves, often marked only by crude wooden crosses that weather erased within years. The financial cost was staggering for most participants. Outfitting for the journey cost approximately $500, equivalent to about $15,000 today. Transportation costs added hundreds more. Most stampeders spent everything they had and borrowed additional money. Those who found no gold returned home broke, in debt, and years older with nothing to show for their efforts except stories and broken health. Families were destroyed by the gold rush. Men abandoned wives and children to chase Klondike gold, intending to return wealthy, but often never returning at all. Some died in the Yukon. Others simply disappeared, starting new lives with money they found or unable to face families they had failed. Women left behind struggled to support themselves and children while waiting for men who often never came back. The indigenous peoples of the Yukon paid perhaps the highest price. The gold rush brought thousands of outsiders into their territory, disrupting traditional ways of life, introducing diseases, and destroying salmon runs that indigenous communities depended on. The Tagish, Tlingit, and Han peoples, who had inhabited the region for millennia, saw their world transformed in 3 years by an invasion of gold seekers who viewed the land only as a source of wealth to be extracted. Dawson City's population collapsed as quickly as it had grown. From a peak of perhaps 30,000 in 1898, the population fell to 5,000 by 1902 and continued declining. Buildings were abandoned, businesses closed, entire streets emptied. The boom town that had appeared from wilderness in months returned to near wilderness almost as quickly. Today, Dawson is a small town of fewer than 2,000 people, its gold rush buildings preserved as tourist attractions and reminders of the brief madness. The Klondike Gold Rush produced approximately $250 million in gold at contemporary prices, equivalent to roughly $7 billion today. This sounds impressive until you calculate the costs. Thousands of lives lost, tens of thousands of people financially ruined, families destroyed, indigenous communities disrupted. The wealth extracted from the Klondike was paid for in human suffering on a massive scale. Most of the gold extracted from the Klondike didn't make prospectors wealthy. It enriched merchants who sold supplies, saloon owners who sold alcohol and entertainment, transportation companies that moved people and goods, and eventually mining companies that industrialized gold extraction. The individual stampeders, the men and women who suffered through the journey and the brutal mining conditions, mostly received nothing or merely enough to survive. George Carmack, who made the initial discovery, was one of the few prospectors who actually benefited permanently. His claim on Bonanza Creek produced approximately $1 million in gold. He left the Yukon, divorced his indigenous wife Kate, married a white woman, and lived comfortably until his death in 1922. His indigenous partners, Skookum Jim and Tagish Charlie, also became wealthy from their claims but faced racial discrimination that Carmack didn't. Their contributions to the discovery were minimized in official histories for decades. The route to the Klondike became obsolete almost as soon as it was established. The White Pass and Yukon Route Railway, completed in 1900, eliminated the need to pack supplies over the mountain passes. But by then, the gold rush was effectively over. The railway served the industrial mining companies that replaced individual prospectors, hauling ore and supplies but carrying few of the dreamers who had swarmed north just years earlier. The Klondike Gold Rush became mythologized almost immediately. Writers like Jack London, who participated in the rush, romanticized it in novels like The Call of the Wild and White Fang. Charlie Chaplin's film The Gold Rush created iconic images of prospectors that shaped public imagination. The reality, cold, hunger, backbreaking labor, and failure for most participants was softened into adventure stories where plucky individuals struck it rich through determination. This romanticization obscured the rush's true nature. It wasn't an adventure. It was a mass delusion driven by economic desperation. The stampeders weren't brave pioneers. They were mostly desperate men making terrible decisions based on wildly unrealistic expectations. The few who succeeded did so through luck, not virtue. The thousands who failed weren't weak. They were victims of their own desperation and the lies told by newspapers and promoters who profited from encouraging the rush. The Klondike Gold Rush was 3 years of madness that transformed the Yukon, killed thousands, enriched a few, and broke the dreams of tens of thousands. The gold remains, still being extracted by modern mining operations. But the stampeders are gone, their stories reduced to historical footnotes and tourist attractions. They chased a dream through frozen hell, and most found nothing but suffering at the end. That's the real story of the Klondike. Not the few who succeeded, but the thousands who failed, and the price they paid for believing they would be different.